final day of ninth grade at Roosevelt High School was supposed to be perfect. Students filled the hallways with laughter, trading yearbooks and promising to stay in touch over summer break. The building buzzed with that special energy that only comes when 3 months of freedom stretch ahead like an endless highway. I was sitting in Mrs. Patterson's English class, carefully reading through the messages my friends had scribbled in my yearbook. Most were the typical teenage fare, inside jokes, promises to hang out, and declarations of eternal friendship that we all knew would fade by October. But as I flipped through the pages, something made my blood run cold. There, beneath the photo of Marcus Chun, a boy I'd never spoken to in my life, was a message written in precise, angular handwriting. Dear Jessica, summer won't last forever. I'll be watching from the shadows until September calls us back together. Your secret admirer, MC. I stared at the page, my hands trembling slightly. Marcus Chun was in my grade, but we'd never shared a single class. He was one of those quiet kids who seemed to drift through the hallways like a ghost, never really connecting with anyone. I'd maybe seen him in the cafeteria a handful of times, always sitting alone with his head buried in a book. The message itself wasn't overtly threatening, but something about it felt wrong. The phrase, watching from the shadows, sent chills down my spine. How did he even know my name? And why had he signed it as my secret admirer when we'd never even made eye contact? I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I gathered my things. The school year was over, and I had plans to spend the summer working at my aunt's boutique in downtown Portland. By the time September rolled around, I'd probably forget all about Marcus Chan and his strange message. That night, I was in my bedroom packing for my summer stay at my aunt's house when I heard a soft tapping at my window. My bedroom was on the second floor, so I assumed it was just a branch from the old oak tree scraping against the glass. But when I looked outside, I saw a figure standing in my backyard, barely visible in the moonlight. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized the silhouette. It was Marcus Chen, standing perfectly still beneath my window, his face tilted upward toward my room. Even from that distance, I could see his eyes reflecting the pale light like a cat's. I quickly ducked below the windowsill, my mind racing. How did he know where I lived? Had he followed me home from school? I waited several minutes before carefully peering out again, but he was gone. The backyard was empty except for shadows dancing in the breeze. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Summer excitement and the stress of finals had probably made me paranoid. I finished packing and left for my aunt's house, determined to put the entire incident behind me. My Aunt Sarah lived in a charming Victorian house in the Pearl District, and I threw myself into working at her vintage clothing store. The days passed in a blur of organizing inventory, helping customers, and exploring the city. For weeks, I barely thought about Roosevelt High School or Marcus Chun. But then the letters started arriving. The first one came in mid-July, addressed to me at my aunt's house. Inside was a single sheet of paper with that same angular handwriting. Jessica, I hope you're enjoying your summer adventure. Portland is such a beautiful city, especially the Pearl District. I've always loved those old Victorian houses with their bay windows and wraparound porches. Sleep well. My hands shook as I read the words. How could he possibly know where I was staying? I hadn't told anyone at school about my summer plans except my closest friends, and none of them would have shared that information with Marcus. I showed the letter to my aunt, who immediately wanted to call the police. But what could I tell them? That a classmate had sent me a letter? There was nothing explicitly threatening about it, just that underlying sense of menace that made my skin crawl. The second letter arrived a week later. This time, it contained a photograph, a picture of me walking into my aunt's store, taken from across the street. On the back, Marcus had written, "You look happy. I'm glad you're finding yourself this summer. Personal growth is so important during the teenage years." That's when we called the police. Officer Martinez was kind but realistic. Without any direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. They could file a report and increase patrols in the area, but ultimately, sending letters wasn't a crime. He suggested we document everything and be extra cautious about security. The third letter was the one that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August, and instead of being addressed to me, it was addressed to my aunt. Inside was a detailed floor plan of her house, with my bedroom marked with a red X. The message was brief. "Sarah, thank you for taking such good care of Jessica. I know where she sleeps." This time, the police took us seriously. Detective Williams assigned to the case explained that this crossed the line into stalking and harassment. They began investigating Marcus Chen, but when they contacted his parents, they discovered something disturbing. Marcus had been reported missing by his family 3 weeks earlier. His parents thought he was staying with a friend, but when they tried to reach him, they realized no one had seen him since the school year ended. The police had been quietly searching for him, but he seemed to have vanished completely. The realization that Marcus was somewhere in Portland, probably watching me, was terrifying. My aunt installed a security system and we started varying our routines, never leaving the house alone. But despite the police presence and precautions, I felt like I was being watched constantly. The final encounter happened on the last night of my summer stay. I was in my room, packing to return home for the start of school, when I heard the front door chime. My aunt was downstairs watching television, so I assumed she was letting someone in. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps that didn't match my aunt's usual quick pace. I called out, asking if everything was okay, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, staring at the doorknob. Slowly, it began to turn. "Aunt Sarah," I whispered, but the door continued to open. Marcus Chen stepped into my room, his appearance shocking after months of living on the streets. His hair was long and matted, his clothes dirty and torn, but his eyes were bright and alert, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to disappear. "Hello, Jessica," he said quietly. "I've missed our conversations." I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Marcus took a step closer, and I noticed he was holding something in his hand, a knife from my aunt's kitchen. "You never responded to my letters," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "I thought maybe you didn't get them, but then I realized you were just playing hard to get. Girls like games, don't they?" That's when I found my voice. I screamed as loud as I could, and I heard my aunt shouting from downstairs. Marcus's expression changed, the calm mask slipping away to reveal something wild and desperate underneath. He lunged toward me, but I rolled off the bed and ran for the door. Behind me, I could hear him crashing into furniture, cursing and stumbling. I made it to the staircase just as my aunt appeared at the bottom, her phone already pressed to her ear. The police arrived within minutes and found Marcus hiding in the basement. He was arrested and eventually sentenced to juvenile detention for stalking and breaking and entering. The psychiatrist who evaluated him said he'd developed an elaborate fantasy relationship with me based on nothing more than seeing me in the hallways at school. I never returned to Roosevelt High School. My parents enrolled me in a private academy across town, and we moved to a new house before my sophomore year started. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just thrown away that yearbook, if I'd never seen Marcus's message in the first place. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. The tradition at Westbrook University was legendary. Every year, on the last day of classes, graduating seniors would gather at the old bell tower in the center of campus for what everyone called last call, an all-night party that marked the end of 4 years of academic torture and the beginning of real life. I should have known that night would end badly. My roommate Jake had been picking fights all semester, his anger issues getting worse as graduation approached. He was one of those guys who thought being aggressive made him tough, who settled every disagreement with his fists instead of his brain. There were 8 of us in our group. Myself, Jake, and our friends Connor, Brett, Michael, Trevor, David, and Ryan. We'd been inseparable since freshman year, bonded by late-night study sessions and weekend adventures. But lately, the dynamic had shifted. Jake's volatile personality was driving wedges between us, and I could feel our friendship fracturing. The party was in full swing by the time we arrived at the bell tower. Hundreds of seniors had gathered in the courtyard, red solo cups in hand, celebrating the end of finals week. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of relief, nostalgia, and anticipation for whatever came next. We'd been drinking for hours when we decided to head back to our off-campus house. The walk took us through downtown Westbrook, a city that had seen better days. Urban decay had crept in over the years, and the streets were littered with abandoned buildings and people who'd been forgotten by society. As we stumbled down Fifth Street, laughing and reminiscing about our college years, we encountered one of the city's many homeless residents. The man was standing in the middle of the crosswalk, swaying slightly, his clothes torn and dirty. He was talking to himself, gesturing wildly at invisible enemies. "Hey!" he shouted when he saw us approaching. "You kids think you're better than everyone else, don't you? With your fancy college degrees and your bright futures." Most of us just wanted to walk around him and continue home. The guy was clearly having some kind of mental health crisis, and the smart thing would have been to give him space and call for help if necessary. But Jake had other ideas. "Get out of the street, you freak!" Jake yelled back, his words slurred from alcohol. "Nobody wants to hear your crazy rambling." The homeless man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward us. "What did you just call me?" "You heard me," Jake said, puffing out his chest. "Move before I make you move." The rest of us tried to intervene, grabbing Jake's arms and trying to pull him away from the confrontation. But he shook us off, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Jake, come on," I said. "Let's just go home." But it was too late. The homeless man had taken Jake's words as a challenge, and he was advancing on our group with surprising speed. Jake met him halfway, shoving the man backward with both hands. "You made a mistake, college boy," the man hissed as he stumbled. "You all made a big mistake." Then he turned and ran into the shadows between two buildings, disappearing so quickly it was like he'd never been there at all. Jake was laughing, high on adrenaline and cheap beer, but the rest of us felt uneasy. There had been something in the man's eyes, or not just anger, but a kind of cold calculation that suggested this wasn't over. We made it back to our house without incident, but as we approached the front door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The small garden gate that led to our backyard was standing wide open, the chain we used to secure it lying broken on the ground. "Did any of you guys go back there today?" I asked, but everyone shook their heads. The gate had been locked when we left for the party. Jake, still riding his confrontation high, decided to investigate. Despite our protests, he grabbed a baseball bat from the front porch and headed around the side of the house alone. The rest of us waited nervously by the front door, listening for any sign of trouble. That's when we heard Jake scream. It wasn't a shout of anger or surprise. It was a scream of pure terror, high-pitched and desperate. We all ran toward the backyard, but by the time we got there, Jake was on the ground, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Standing over him was the homeless man from the street, but he looked different now. His earlier disheveled appearance had been replaced by a cold, methodical demeanor. In his hand was a crowbar, dark with Jake's blood. "I told you that you made a mistake," he said calmly, as if we were discussing the weather. "Now you're all going to pay for disrespecting me." Connor was the first to react, tackling the man around the waist and sending them both crashing into our neighbor's fence. The crowbar went flying, and the rest of us jumped into the fight, trying to subdue the intruder while someone called 911. But the man was stronger than he looked, and he fought with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. He broke free from Connor's grip and came at me with his bare hands, his fingernails clawing at my face and leaving deep scratches that burned like fire. I managed to throw him off, but he was back on his feet in seconds, searching for another weapon. That's when David tackled him from behind, and this time we managed to hold him down until the police arrived. Jake spent 3 days in the hospital with a concussion and 12 stitches in his scalp. The homeless man, whose name was Robert Vance, was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon. During his booking, police discovered he had a long history of mental illness and violent encounters with college students. The worst part was learning that Robert had been following us for weeks, ever since Jake had gotten into a fight with another homeless man outside a campus bar. Apparently, word had spread through the homeless community that there was a group of aggressive college kids who liked to pick fights with people who couldn't defend themselves. Robert had been planning his revenge for weeks, learning our routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The confrontation on the street hadn't been random. It had been carefully orchestrated to get us angry and off guard. I never saw Jake the same way after that night. His need to prove himself had nearly gotten all of us killed. And for what? To show dominance over someone who was already at the bottom of society's ladder? We all graduated a few days later, but the celebration felt hollow. Our friendship never recovered from that night. Jake moved to another state for work, and the rest of us slowly drifted apart. The bonds that had held us together for 4 years finally snapping under the weight of what we'd experienced. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we just walked around Robert that night, if we'd chosen compassion over confrontation. But then I remember the look in his eyes when he was standing over Jake's unconscious body, and I realized that some encounters are inevitable. Some people are just waiting for an excuse to unleash the darkness they carry inside them. Jake gave Robert that excuse, and we all paid the price for his arrogance. I still have scars on my face from that night, thin white lines that remind me every morning that violence has consequences, and that sometimes the person you hurt is the one who's been planning to hurt you back. Lincoln Middle School had always felt too big for its own good. With over 1,200 students crammed into a building designed for half that number, chaos was a constant companion. But on the last day of 7th grade, the usual disorder took on a different quality, something darker and more purposeful than typical teenage mayhem. I was in Mr. Rodriguez's social studies class, one of the few rooms I shared with Daniel Kovac, a kid who'd been giving me the creeps all year. Daniel was one of those students who seemed to exist on the periphery of everything, never quite fitting in but never quite invisible either. He had this habit of sitting in the back corner of every classroom, as far from the teacher and as close to the emergency exit as possible. Every single day, Daniel wore the same outfit: black cargo pants and a dark green hoodie that looked like it belonged to someone twice his size. When teachers called on him, his voice was so deep and gravelly that other kids would snicker, thinking he was putting on an act. But I'd heard him speak enough times to know that's just how he sounded, like a 40-year-old man trapped in a 13-year-old's body. The thing that bothered me most about Daniel was his complete isolation. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because it seemed so deliberate. Other kids had tried to include him in conversations or group activities, but he'd always decline with this weird intensity, like social interaction was physically painful for him. During lunch, while everyone else was in the cafeteria, Daniel would disappear to the far edge of the playground, where the school property met the woods. He'd stand there for the entire 30-minute break, sometimes appearing to talk to someone beyond the fence line, though I never saw anyone there. On that final day of school, Lincoln Middle had its annual tradition called musical classrooms. Students were encouraged to visit different teachers throughout the day, signing yearbooks and saying goodbye before summer break. It was organized chaos, with kids wandering the halls freely and teachers relaxing their usual strict classroom management. I was in Mrs. Chen's math class, which was packed with students who were supposed to be elsewhere, when I noticed something strange. There were at least 6 kids in the room I'd never seen before in my life. In a school where you eventually recognize most faces, even if you don't know names, these students stood out as completely unfamiliar. They weren't participating in the yearbook signing or the general festivities. Instead, they sat scattered throughout the room, all wearing similar dark clothing, all watching the rest of us with the same unsettling intensity I'd grown accustomed to seeing in Daniel's eyes. Daniel himself was exhibiting behavior that was strange even by his standards. His usual foot tapping had escalated to an aggressive drumming that echoed through the classroom. His head moved constantly, scanning the room like he was tracking multiple targets. Every few minutes, his gaze would lock onto one of the unfamiliar students, and they'd exchange almost imperceptible nods. Mrs. Chun was clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of order. She kept glancing at the clock and checking her phone, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness. When she walked to her desk and picked up the classroom phone, I could see her hands shaking. She spoke quietly into the receiver, turning her back to the class. Within minutes, Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring classroom appeared in our doorway. The two teachers stepped into the hallway for a hushed conversation that lasted maybe 30 seconds, but their body language screamed urgency. When they returned, they moved through the classroom in a coordinated pattern, approaching specific students, always the ones I didn't recognize, and whispering instructions. One by one, these mysterious students gathered their belongings and followed Mrs. Patterson out of the room. Daniel's agitation increased dramatically as his unknown allies disappeared. The foot tapping became violent enough to shake his desk, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the classroom's air conditioning. That's when the fire alarm began its piercing wail. Mrs. Chen's reaction was telling. Instead of the usual teacher frustration at an interruption, she looked relieved. She quickly organized us into a line and led us toward the emergency exit, her movements sharp and purposeful rather than the casual pace typical of fire drills. As we filed out of the building, I found myself in the standard formation on the athletic field behind the school. Students were grouped by homeroom, teachers taking attendance and trying to maintain order among hundreds of excited kids who thought they were getting an early start to summer vacation. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. I turned back toward the school building, and my blood ran cold. In one of the second-floor windows, I could see movement, a figure darting between classrooms, clearly still inside the supposedly evacuated building. The figure appeared again, this time in a different window, moving with purpose rather than panic. Even from that distance, I could make out the dark clothing and familiar silhouette. It was Daniel, and he wasn't alone. I could see at least two other figures moving through the building with him. That's when the police sirens began echoing across the field. Not one or two patrol cars, but what sounded like the entire Westwood Police Department descending on Lincoln Middle School. Officers emerged from their vehicles in tactical gear, moving toward the building with weapons drawn and radios crackling with urgent communications. Principal Morrison appeared on the field with a megaphone, instructing all students to remain calm and stay with their teachers. But I could see the fear in the adults' faces. This wasn't a drill, and it wasn't a typical end-of-year prank. We waited on that field for nearly 2 hours before anyone explained what was happening. Parents began arriving to pick up their children, and gradually the truth emerged through fragments of adult conversations and worried whispers. According to what I pieced together, Daniel had somehow orchestrated the infiltration of Lincoln Middle School by a group of teenagers who didn't belong there. These weren't students from other schools playing a harmless prank. They were older kids, some with criminal records, who had been systematically gathering intelligence about our school's layout and security procedures. The most chilling detail came from my mother when she finally picked me up. She'd spoken with Mrs. Chun, who revealed that she discovered suspicious items in several backpacks belonging to the unfamiliar students, items that suggested they were planning to start a fire in the school building. But the plan had been more sophisticated than simple arson. Daniel had been feeding information to this group for weeks, using his daily conversations at the fence line during lunch to coordinate with older accomplices who were planning to use the last day of school chaos as cover for their attack. The fire drill had been Mrs. Chen's quick thinking, a way to evacuate the building while alerting authorities without causing panic. Daniel and his remaining conspirators had hidden somewhere in the school during the evacuation, probably planning to start their fire once they thought the building was empty. Police arrested Daniel and 3 other teenagers that day. I never learned all the details, but rumors circulated that they'd been planning to burn down parts of the school as some kind of statement about their experiences with the education system. The most disturbing part was learning that Daniel had been recruiting other students throughout the year, identifying kids who felt marginalized or angry and trying to draw them into his plan. Several students came forward after his arrest, admitting that he'd approached them with vague suggestions about making the school pay for various perceived injustices. I never saw Daniel again after that day. His family moved away over the summer, and Lincoln Middle School implemented new security measures that made the building feel more like a prison than a school. The musical classroom tradition was permanently discontinued, and teachers began monitoring students much more closely during unstructured time. But the experience changed something fundamental about how I viewed my classmates. The realization that someone I'd sat next to for an entire school year had been planning something so destructive was terrifying. It made me wonder how many other students were carrying dark thoughts behind their everyday facades. Sometimes I still think about those conversations Daniel was having at the fence line, and I wonder how long he'd been planning his attack. Had he been watching all of us, studying our routines and looking for weaknesses? Had he chosen that particular day because he knew we'd all be distracted by end-of-year festivities? The scariest part is that his plan almost worked. If Mrs. Chun hadn't noticed those unfamiliar faces and trusted her instincts, if she hadn't acted quickly to alert authorities, Daniel and his accomplices might have succeeded in burning down at least part of our school, with us still inside.